Well, thanks. We have had a great morning, and actually, we've been telling stories in the back, so I want to get to those really quickly. Throughout this morning, we have talked about the incoming administration's plans. Maybe it's $1 trillion, but as we've said, it might be a different number. But in any case, big investment in infrastructure and where this goes. And yet, we're not really convinced that that's all money that goes into what we think of as infrastructure, right? What does that mean?
Well, I think that's right. This whole definition of infrastructure actually is more than an academic exercise. It really matters because the different modes, the different sectors are all designed, governed, and financed and delivered very different from one another. Some modes, freight rail, for example, has a huge private sector influence already, or they own and operate the system right now. Other things, public transit, some water systems are really publicly sector driven. So it really depends on what we're thinking about with this broad definition, because how we deliver these projects really matters.
And where we get this magic $1 trillion number from, I mean, where does that money really come from? And how do you make free money?
So that's a terrific point, Joie. There is no free money, obviously. And so one of the key issues I think we need to keep in mind as this infrastructure debate moves forward is a point I often make about the distinction between the funding of infrastructure, the underlying dollars, and where we get those from versus the financing of infrastructure. Those two concepts are often confused, particularly when we talk about the role of public-private partnerships and greater private sector participation in the delivery of infrastructure. So the funding of infrastructure, broadly speaking, comes from only one of two broad sources. One is some type of user fee, like a toll, or the state of Oregon is doing a mileage-based user fee, facility-specific fees. In New York City, we're familiar with facility-specific fees, or some broader-based tax money that's dedicated specifically to that infrastructure. So the underlying funding, I think, is the key policy issue that we need to think about. And I would like us to use this debate as an opportunity to think about shifting towards more effective sources of funding, such as what the state of Oregon is doing, moving away from taxes on fossil fuels like gas and diesel tax, which we're trying to discourage the use of.
All right, before we get to that, I just want to elaborate a little bit on this. I mean, after all, what we've heard from the administration suggests that we are looking to more private sources for funding these kinds of big projects. Will that work?
Partly. I mean, I think that they're talking about an 82% tax credit, federal tax credit for private investment in infrastructure. And again, the definition matters. Is real estate infrastructure?
Is education?
To some people it is. Education, hospitals, schools, industrial parks, logistics centers. You can really make this a broad definition. And then you get into this concern that folks have that, well, these are investments the private sector was going to make anyway. So why is the federal government subsidizing, to a large degree, these investments that are really just benefiting private sector investors? So we've got to do a better job of figuring out what do we want to get to? What kind of infrastructure do we need in this country that would support and justify a massive federal subsidy? There probably is some stuff that we need to do. We just don't know what that is right now.
We have talked a bit about user fees and alternative ways to look at this private source of funding. How does it work? I love the Oregon example that you gave me.
Oh, so the state of Oregon is clearly the leader. They've been doing wave 3, I think, of pilot projects and trying to move from a per gallon tax on some type of fuel, gas or diesel, to a per mile fee. And it seems like a pretty simple. So you can see why you would want to do that if you're trying to discourage, A, the use of fossil fuels, and you're trying to link the divorce, I should say, the type of fuel that the vehicle uses from its use of the road. So somebody who drives a Tesla that's fully electric may have a high income, but they're not paying anything in gas taxes, almost by definition, for the use of the road. So it's both efficient in the sense that we charge people for the thing that they use, which is a lane mile separate from the type of fuel the vehicle uses. And it's also equitable in the sense that you use a lane mile, you pay.
It is more transparent in that way. As a practical matter, how would that work? I mean, how would you know how much I'd driven?
Yeah, so there's actually sort of a menu of options in the state of Oregon. And one is, as I said, it's like the all-you-can-eat version of road use where you pay a fee and no one knows where your vehicle is or how many miles you actually
I could live in my garage all the time.
You could live anywhere you want.
Yeah.
You pay that road fee and you're done. There's another which is a small box about this big that hooks into the car's USB port that actually tracks the speedometer of the car. It doesn't know where your vehicle is. Privacy is completely protected. If we know what the car's speedometer is doing, then we
So
know
if
how
I'm
many
driving
miles
70
you're
miles an
driving.
hour all the time, well, not that I would be. If I were driving
wouldn't advise
55 miles an hour all the time, you would know that I had been using highways.
A certain amount of road space, exactly. And we charge 2 or 3 cents per mile based on that. And you get a bill the same way you get an electric bill, a water bill, a cell phone bill, et cetera, where you're charged per unit of use per kilowatt hour of electricity. The idea is to shift from a per gallon fee to a per unit of road space, and we're used to that and a bunch of other utilities.
So this kind of innovation is going to have to come from private sector?
Not necessarily. I mean, we're talking about some public sector innovations. The states, in this case, the state was a real leader in this. The legislature really gave the State Department of Transportation the impetus to go ahead and do these pilot tests. The federal government can help do that, but it's important to recognize that with all this infrastructure, the federal government isn't building anything, right? These are not just, even though the new administration wants to come in and build a lot of new infrastructure, it all has to come from the bottom up. The states, the cities, the metro areas define what they want to get done. It has to go through all the approval process and things like that. The federal government can help do that, but it's really the states and the cities that are driving all this. And we actually saw this on election day when, obviously focused on the presidential election, but there were hundreds and hundreds of local ballot measures that went before voters on election day, almost 500 of these all across the country. And a lot of these things passed. About 2/3 of them wound up passing. When people know what they're getting, they know the projects that they're going to invest in, they know the sources, the transparency issue you're talking about, they're willing to pay for these things. And we see this happening in place after place after place, and it's only going to be more important in the future.
So communities want to dictate what happens for their own.
They always do, they always have. Now they're willing to really step up and pay for it. Gas taxes, sales taxes, bonds, all kinds of different things.
So when the incoming administration talks about making big investments, $1 trillion, as it were, into infrastructure, what is that? That's not quite literal, is it? It's not. Do we need to go down the street and get $1 trillion out of these folks?
Well, that's going to be tough, I think. I think that it's back to this broad definition of infrastructure. You can include a lot of different things in here, but it's still going to be tough. I mean, $1 trillion is a lot of money, no matter how creative you are. So, even a broad definition, if we're including real estate, we're including some of these other investments we're making, you could probably get pretty close. But it's going to be interesting to figure out how we get.
Can you get it through tax breaks? Can you get that much money?
Well, that's the plan. I mean, they want to make this revenue neutral by paying back the tax credits with the taxes that are levied on people who are actually doing the construction and the economic development that comes from those projects. It's the right way to think about it because all that's connected. We don't want to think about infrastructure as something separate. It is fundamentally connected to all these different things. But that math is going to be a tough one to figure out because we're not paying people the same.
Yeah.
Where do you go to get $1 trillion?
I don't. If I knew, that would be a
we
great thing.
wouldn't
I'd
be
go
sitting
get
here.
it. But I think there are things, Joey, that you can do that would really enhance the efficiency of delivery of infrastructure in the United States. And I think we have a series of endemic problems that are pretty well agreed upon with our infrastructure. The United States is good at building shiny new stuff and having a ribbon cutting ceremony. We're pretty bad at taking care of the stuff that we already have. That is the operation and maintenance of roads, of airports, of bridges, of tunnels, things like this.
Potholes are not sexy.
Potholes are not sexy to fix. It's not sexy to put 3 millimeters of macadam on a road to do what the civil engineers told you had to do. But that's the stuff you have to do to properly maintain it. So I think an important role of the private sector can be to commit the public sector to, say, contracting out the operation and maintenance of a facility and keep that up to spec. In some sense, properly maintaining it over the decades so it doesn't fall apart as quickly. So we need to develop a better model for the operation and maintenance of the stuff we already have rather than building. We're not going to build a new interstate system. We have a wonderful interstate system already. We're going to improve what we already have and hopefully take care of that. And I believe the private sector can play a big role in that sort of stuff and actually add value to
But
it.
the private sector is always just going to cherry pick, right, for the things that are going to make them money. I mean, that's the Amtrak issue, right? That the only thing that really makes you money is from here up to Boston.
Yeah, so, well, that is actually, I think, a misconception that they will be attracted to where the profits are, but the facilities themselves don't have to create revenue in order to use a public-private partnership. There's something that people should be aware of called an availability payments public-private partnership. And this is where you pay the private sector based on how available the lanes are for use. So if there's an accident, a dead animal, there's flooding, how quickly do you get that out of the way so that the lane is available for use, and you compensate the private sector operator based on that? So it builds performance incentives into the contract. This is Port of Miami Tunnel is being done under this sort of an arrangement. There's a lot of these things where it's not necessarily that the road itself generates revenue and attracts the private sector in. It's that the public sector gets innovative about how it contracts with the private sector and compensates it based on performance incentives. And that's being done all around the world, and I think it can really improve the operation of the infrastructure we already have.
If the public sector knows what it wants. I think in all these cases we've seen that they've got to know exactly what they're trying to get done with an infrastructure project. They have to know what risks they're willing to take, and they have to be willing to walk away if the deal's not working out the way they want it to. And I think time and time again, we've seen all the things that Rick's talking about, that the worst projects are the ones where the public sector gets hemmed into something, they can't get out of it, and then we have spurious projects that don't really meet any public policy goals, and they really can't negotiate a better deal. I think the way you set it up is exactly right. If they know what they want, they know all the maintenance and the standards that they want to set, there's no telling what we can get done.
And we talked earlier about this notion of incentivizing, using the best technologies, using the newest things that are available that we ignore in infrastructure projects because we're too busy worrying about building, another 10-lane highway.
Right. Well, yeah, that's great, Joie. One of the things is I talk to road engineers and different people around the country with regard to these things. They say one of the biggest benefits of including the private sector in the procurement of some sort of a new project, or it could be renovative an old one, is something called alternative technical concepts, ATCs. And that's the idea that the public sector says, we know we need a bridge, it has to go across this valley, it has to last this long, it has to hold this weight, and we're thinking of this amount of traffic to go through, and they bid that out, and the private sector will come back with alternative, innovative designs, right, about how to deliver that same capacity. So maybe instead of 2 lanes next to each other, they could be one on top of the other, right? That would just be a design that maybe the public sector hadn't fully considered, but a private sector bidder will come forward and say, here's an alternative way to get to that same result that you need. And I hear it time and again that sort of innovation in the bidding is a very high value thing you get from the private sector participation.
Why doesn't that happen now? I mean, why isn't that sort of ingenuity? Why doesn't that happen?
Some of it's happening. There are a couple of places in the country that know what they're doing. They have an experience in this, and they build from administration to administration, and they can learn. But we've had tax-free municipal bond market for a long time, and it's been cheaper in some ways for the public sector to do things the way they've always done. We had a federal government that was giving money to places, so there really wasn't that incentive. But now, as Rick was saying, they're looking for new innovations, they're looking for good ideas, and it's kind of this idea that they've run out of money, it's time to start thinking. It's probably not the best way to get into these deals. They should be taking advantage of the new innovations and ideas like that, but we're in this situation now because finances are tight, and they're looking for all kinds of different options.
Questions from the audience? Are there any folks who want to talk? There's a gentleman behind you, actually. Wow, back of the room.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. You're talking about some of these new concepts being used for some bigger projects. How about for small routine projects like sidewalks, bike paths? Has there anything innovative been done there in the way of funding and financing and management?
So I could address, I don't know about those specific sidewalks and bike paths, but one of the interesting areas for public-private partnerships that we're taking a look at Cornell studying is streetlights. And it's a great example of the private sector. So I don't know how the lights in here work, but we're all familiar, hopefully, with LED lighting. And as you may know, you can get more light, brightness from an LED bulb with less energy than you can with the old incandescent. And for example, Paris recently undertook a massive public-private partnership to replace the bulbs in their streetlights with a private sector company. Detroit has done this, and that's interesting because basically the private sector will come in and replace the bulbs for free to the city if the private sector can capture some of the efficiency gains of replacing those old bulbs with LED. If they say, hey, let's share 50-50, you're going to get a lower electric bill, you, the city of Detroit, share some of those savings with us, and we'll come in and have our teams replace those bulbs. So these sort of unusual types of infrastructure that we don't often think about, maybe street lighting, you really can benefit from the private sector's innovation and incentives, and can actually do it at very low cost if there's that big savings. I'd have to think it through on sidewalks, but you could probably do something similar.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about this idea of something you saw at CMU where lighting could be timed at a human level, not...
That was, yeah, so Joey's talking about Carnegie Mellon's engineer. I'll give a plug. Their civil engineering department is a leader in traffic lights. So traffic lights that have cameras attached, and those traffic lights can see, quote unquote, or sense the number of vehicles coming in each direction. And it's not just a light that goes red, yellow, green based on a timer.
Yeah.
Right? It actually is based on the traffic that's coming at that intersection from different angles. And when I was there chatting with those folks, the technology can recognize pedestrians. It can tell the difference between a dog and a person. It can tell a person in a wheelchair. And it can optimize the changing of the lights to allow all those people to sort of optimally pass through the intersection rather than this and that saves fuel, that saves time, that saves aggravation. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of we all know that experience of sitting at a red light when there's nobody there. So it would solve that problem.
These are the things that private partnerships can create new opportunities for.
Sure, if the public sector knows what it wants, they can build in all these things that the questioner asked for. We're looking for, where I'm a mayor, I want more pedestrian access, I want safer streets, I want better access for low-income neighborhoods. If they lay out all those things, the private sector can come and we can do all that. But if it's not laid out, they're not going to do it. So it really starts with having the capacity on the local level from mayors, state departments of transportation, city councils. They've got to be aligned with what they're trying to get out of these projects. Whatever it is, they can lay it all out. And if the private sector wants to come in, they can. But they're not going to do it without that help from the top down.
Any other questions in this group? Okay, just then as we wrap up the hour, I just want to get some feel for you of how things are going to change. I know it's the huge question, but how things are going to change after January 20th in terms of these kinds of projects. Just a last thought.
Well, we just went through a campaign where both candidates were talking about infrastructure.
Sure.
This issue's been pushed to the front burner of the policy discourse, and you had Governor Rendell here today. Folks like him have been doing everything they can to make this part of the national conversation. But I think we've got to be realistic about what we can accomplish. But I think the private role in infrastructure is going to be pushed front and center. It could just be things like P3s. We're going to do all that anyway. But we have private firms that are literally transforming cities with transportation, not just Lyft and Uber and Bridge and car share and bike share. There's all these new private actors that are providing transportation in the way that we used to think it was more of a public sector role. So this is all changing now anyway. This administration could do a lot to help provide a framework for that and keep it moving.
Yes, so Joy, I think it's great. I agree with Rob that it's going to be in the public eye. I don't think that I recall a time when infrastructure has been so front and center. Seems like the only issue that the two candidates really agreed on and both pushed together was the issue of the nation's infrastructure. What I would like to see is taking this opportunity to think about really meaningful long-term policy reforms to build into any bill that will last decades, rather than simply spending a lot of money on infrastructure in sort of a one-shot stimulus. Let's talk about air traffic control reform. Our air traffic control system is outdated. Amtrak is a great service, but I think it could be improved a lot by doing what some other countries do in terms of public-private partnerships. I've studied the U.S. Postal Service, which I think is an underappreciated aspect of the U.S. infrastructure. The United States is 20 years behind in terms of the policy reforms associated with postal services. And also, Rob talked about the tax-exempt municipal debt, which artificially, because of the tax code, lowers the cost of borrowing if it's publicly issued debt. And I think we should think about serious reforms to level that cost of capital playing field between privately issued debt and publicly issued debt, because a lot of this infrastructure delivery is really about the debt markets and issuing bonds to pay for it.
How we pay for things.
How we pay for it.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.